Welcome. In this video on the causes of the Civil War, we'll quickly review the Compromise of 1850 and the elections of 48 and 52, and we'll look at the Kansas question and the violence that breaks out as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act leading up to the Civil War. First, last time we talked briefly about the decision that had to be made over the territory brought in to the United States from Mexico called the Mexican Cession after the U.S.-Mexico War. Both the election of 1848 and 1852, this was a central issue. What to do about slavery in this new massive land taken from Mexico. They thought that the Compromise of 1850 would solve the issue. This all came crashing down in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As Kansas and Nebraska are being recognized as territories, this is different from being unorganized territory, which is just the territory of the United States. And between that and being a specific state, there's the position of being an organized territory. Almost all territory now are organized territories, but you need a certain population threshold, and you have to decide what type of rules and laws will govern yourself as an organized territory. In this proposal put forward by Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, nicknamed the Little Giant, Stephen Douglas puts together the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opens Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty. This idea that the people themselves could decide, but this meant that it would mark a repeal of the old Missouri Compromise, which had been on the books for nearly 35 years. Many thought this was an ironclad guarantee of restricting slavery in the old Louisiana Purchase territory, and now they would open this back up. It's extremely controversial in Congress and in the nation, and some people think this is a must and is the most natural thing. There are others who see in this a plot that the slave power, these nefarious, wealthy and powerful slave owners, have been plotting this for a long time. But you see a cross-cut of all kinds of people who supported it. Alexander Stephens, I believe, governor of Georgia; Jefferson Davis, senator from Mississippi, the future president of the Confederacy; and Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy. You had the current president, Democrat from New Hampshire, President Pierce, also endorsing this as a good thing to open it to popular sovereignty. And before we maybe only see it from the perspective of slavery expanding, remember that that is the cornerstone of any democratic system. Popular sovereignty. The people rule. The people are king. They democratically decide for themselves. Now, set aside the fact that, of course, black slaves were not being asked their opinion, of course, but that notwithstanding, you could argue this is a democratic thing, that if the people in a territory want slavery or don't want it, it's their business, not the federal government. And that the hope by many of these people was not only really that slavery would expand, because some of them were not big proponents of slavery, but some of them just wanted to stop fighting, just wanted compromise. They just recognized that the South was no longer the dominant part of the country, and that Southerners and their way of life felt threatened. And so they felt that being the more powerful section, the North, they should be generous and magnanimous to the weaker section, the South, in order to prevent them feeling like they weren't getting what they needed out of the Union. You also see people violently oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We already talked about William Henry Seward, senator from New York, who would be the Republican, nearly the Republican nominee in the future, going up against Lincoln. Another challenger for the Republican nomination would be Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Another outspoken anti-slavery opponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. He is the man who will famously be beaten nearly to death on the floor of the United States Senate for the speech that he gives about what's happening in Kansas in just another year or two. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, while being controversial, does pass. It is endorsed by virtually anyone who wants to expand slavery and almost anyone that wants to compromise. These are kind of the minority anti-slavery people. What happens in Kansas? What happens in Kansas is open violence. This period of the next few years is known as the bleeding of Kansas, or bleeding Kansas. What happens is, as soon as you had enough people, you could apply for statehood. Well, and then majority rules. Well, what happens is thousands more flock to Kansas. The population hits the threshold, but you have a day set when there's going to be a vote on the Constitution. But the first one to get put forward, you see slave owners and you see Missourians who are in favor of a slave state in Kansas crossing the border, voting illegally, using violence, intimidation, and the threat of violence in order to keep free state Kansans away from the polls. And so the Lecompton Constitution, with its pro-slavery heart in the cities of like Leavenworth and Atchison, promoted a slave state constitution and sent it to the Congress. The Free Staters, often a nickname for the Free State Kansans, were Jayhawkers. The Jayhawkers were outraged at what had happened and felt like it was unfair influence by the Missourians and by the pro-slave state activists. They said that this election that approved a slave constitution was illegal, and they used violence and the threat of violence, so it was illegal. So they pick another day and say, we're going to vote on this free state constitution, and lo and behold, that also passes. Now, does that mean truly a majority of people wanted it? Perhaps. It also means that anyone who already supported this constitution, they didn't vote the second time around, because to do so would be to accept that they had done something wrong the first time. So both of them pass, and so what they do is they send their constitution to Congress. So you had sort of fraud and intimidation led to the first election getting that pro-slave constitution. A second one, when all the pro-slave people sit out, is a pro-freedom constitution. They have two capitals, and they send both constitutions to Congress and basically put this issue that Congress had tried to push off to the states back in Congress's lap. People all over the country tried to help influence this decision. You had hundreds of people moving to Kansas from New England for the express purpose of joining sort of anti-slavery gangs and trying to use violence and the threat of violence to prohibit slavery. You had a preacher named Henry Ward Beecher who very famously sent rifles in boxes labeled Bibles. And so that particular type of rifle or gun was known as a Beecher Bible, because when they were sent to Kansas to arm the people of Kansas against each other in violence over whether or not they would have slavery or freedom in Kansas. Starting in 1856, you had this period of open violence where there were over 200 political murders in a state of under 100,000 people. You also saw many Missourians cross the border in the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence was a major free state bastion, a city that mainly supported the Jayhawker position, and the Missourians crossed the border, and they were often known as bushwhackers or ruffians. And they rode into Lawrence. The people of Lawrence got the word, and the people actually all fled the town, and the Missourians burned Lawrence to the ground. And there was only one casualty, and it was one Missourian. And then they rode back to Missouri. When this happened, in the context of these open murders going unsolved and unpunished, one of the major free state cities, Lawrence, being burned down by pro-slavery men, you had the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner give a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he goes in an explicit way calling out anyone who endorsed slavery as being, in a way, like whoring themselves out to slavery and opposing Kansas in what was then an extraordinarily sexually explicit way. And he did so in a way that called out the senior senator, an old man, the senior senator from Mississippi, and besmirched his name and linked him to supporting this type of violence and this type of slavery, and that is what slavery stands for, is this type of violence. Well, the other senator from Mississippi, after this speech, walked up behind Senator Sumner. So the junior senator of Mississippi is named Preston Brooks, walked up behind Senator Sumner with his cane and struck him on the back of the head, knocking him out of his chair, and proceeded to wail away on him till he was unconscious and his cane broke. There were those who called for him to be kicked out of the Senate, those who called for him to be imprisoned. What actually happened, the Senate censured him and said, "You shouldn't have done that." He did not go to jail. What did his constituents at home think? Well, he was mailed several dozen new canes by his supporters and people from Mississippi who admired what he had done to stand up for the honor of other senators from Mississippi. This happened in the room, on the floor of the United States Senate. So when people say that today we're more divided than we ever are, they're neglecting a lot of history. Finally, the events of Kansas accelerate with the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. A man named John Brown, whom one of our readings will soon be about, he and his sons and his anti-slavery men break into the homes of pro-slavery men at night and hack them to death with broadswords. And then they retreat back to their Osawatomie compound. They have a series of a few houses and barns at Osawatomie where they're holed up. Well, a bunch of Missourians cross the border and form a posse with a bunch of pro-slave Kansans, and they lay siege to the Brown family compound at Osawatomie. And a shootout ensues with these hundreds of people firing into these houses and barns on the Brown family farm. They did a little bit have some warning that this was coming. They have a shootout on their way out, and in the night and in the confusion, Brown, most of his family, and most of his supporters are able to fight a rearguard action and escape being surrounded and flee Kansas and go off the grid into hiding. No one knows where he went for a long time, and he goes into hiding after having committed this massacre and then having nearly been assassinated in retaliation for it, even though his son and one of his neighbors were killed in this fight. The war just continues between the Missouri ruffians, the Jayhawkers, and it's a full-on guerrilla war in Kansas. How does this resolve? Well, in January of 1861, after the election of 1860, in the midst of the secession crisis, the slave government was considered the accepted, legitimate government. That was legitimate, but the Senate, being balanced, refused to actually fully accept Kansas as a state. Only after the southern states seceded in 1861 did Northerners have a successful majority in the Senate to approve Kansas statehood, and they instead, by 1861, approved the free state Kansas Constitution. Next time, we'll pick up with the next topic after westward expansion with the fear of slave rebellion and the Dred Scott court case. Thanks for watching.